Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my LEC round number 2 and round number 3 overview and analysis video of the Winter Split Playoffs. That's what I'm titling this video. I know it's not technically accurate. Technically, round number 3 isn't happening this week. It's happening next week, but round 4, at least the start of round 4, happened this past weekend, and we had games from rounds 1 and 2, and so I'm kind of including both of those into round 2. You can understand why this is a bit of a difficult video to title for me, but I hope it makes a little bit of sense. This is the second weekend of games here in the LEC playoffs, and I'm excited to get into it. We are going to know our first couple of teams officially eliminated from the playoffs here in obviously 7th and 8th, and then of course in 5th and 6th, depending on who ends up winning some of these series. We're going to know who's going to be moving on to the best of 5 stage from the lower bracket, and we're going to be covering winners finals in today's video. We're going to be going over which one of the two teams that has remained undefeated in the best of 3s up until this point will be able to take their first best of 5 and move themselves onto grand finals, where the loser of course has to go down into the semifinals. A lot to talk about in today's video. If you are excited, let me know down in the comment section below. Always curious to hear you guys' thoughts and opinions. I obviously have mine, and I'll be going over them in today's video, but I'm always curious to hear where you guys agree or disagree with me. Obviously, I'm not expecting you to agree with me on everything that I say. Always curious to get feedback and just thoughts and general takes from the people who watch these videos. I know you guys are hardcore League of Legends fans, LEC fans, and so I'm always curious to hear what you guys' thoughts are and how they might differ from mine. But of course, today, we're going to be going over everything. If you are new to the channel, what we're going to be doing is going series by series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each series that we cover, and at the end of the video, I will be wrapping everything up by previewing the top 4. We will know the top 4 by the end of this, the two teams that are going to be fighting it out to make it to the semifinals, one team in the semifinals and one team in the actual grand finals itself by the end of this, guaranteeing themselves a top 2 finish basically no matter what. There is a lot on the line for everybody involved. Basically every series that we're going to talk about today, all 5 of them are must wins for every single team. 4 of them are elimination series and 1 of them is winners finals. And so without further ado, let's get into it. I don't want to waste you guys' time too much. We're 2.5 minutes into this video already, but let's go ahead and get into our first series. We will be starting with the lower bracket. We'll get to winners finals at the end of the video because they did that one last anyways, and so we're going to be starting with our lower bracket round number 1 matchups, and of course these are matchups between teams that ended up losing in the upper bracket round number 1 that couldn't get a win in their first best of 3. This is to stay alive. If you lose one of these, you're going to be one of the first 2 teams officially out of the playoffs, which is never a good thing. And our first one is probably the more interesting of the two, in my opinion. It's a matchup between the number 7 seeded Team BDS and the number 5 seeded Team Vitality that BDS is going to pick up a 2-1 series win in. This was a hectic, chaotic, unbelievable series between both of these teams. Both of them are playing super aggro, super risky, specifically Vitality. This was a very Vitality series just in general with the way that they were operating and just generally the output that you had. Like Karzi gives, Karzi takes. Hylissang sometimes is phenomenal. I think a lot of the games that Vitality won this year were basically just through Hylissang. Almost every single one of them, in my opinion, was some form of Hylissang just being the best player on the Rift. It reminded me a ton of Lehens, but when things go wrong for Hylissang, they go incredibly wrong. Like more wrong than any other support, not only in the entire league, but maybe in the entire world in terms of the top 4 major regions. It's just incredible how bad he can look when things are just not working out. We'll talk about it there, but you know, for BDS, there are a lot of positives to take away from this. I don't think that they are a perfect team, but I'm really not surprised to see them come out on top here. I did predict them to be able to win this series, and I think a lot of that was because I just had so much faith in the middle of the map right now. For BDS, Nuke has been unbelievably good for them across not only this year, but a lot of last year as well. Like, he has just leveled up into being one of the most consistent mid laners in the entirety of the LEC, and I think that is reflective by this performance. GIANTX was pretty solid on the other side of this. That Mel was doing a ton of damage in game number 3. We'll talk about that when we get to the Vitality section, but Nuke was really good outside of some errant shock blasts that ended up going wide from the Jace. I think for the most part, especially early on in this series on the Victor in game number 1, he was integral towards this team's success, and I do not think they would have been in nearly as good of a position without him. He is the best player on BDS right now. That's become abundantly clear, but he's not player of the series. That to me's got to go to Paris in the support position, and man, you really needed to see this. You needed to see Paris step up and just be the most influential and active player on the entire map. Now, these aren't the most flashy games in the world. world. You're not going to walk away from this in the same way that you would walk away from a Hylissang game if he were to pop off, like on the other side of this. It's not the same kind of dominance. This is much more structured. It's much more controlled, but I think it's just as impressive that he was able to be as useful as he was, especially on the Blitzcrank in game number 3, when the enemy team actually doesn't really lose to Blitzcrank all that easily, unless you're Carzzy and you're just ulting into the backline. But Paris was awesome. I thought he played probably his best series of the entire year here against Vitality, and they really needed him to do that. Hopefully he can start getting his feet under him. I know that it's hard to be a rookie, but I was expecting more out of him in split number 1. It's not necessarily happened so far. This is at least trending in the right direction, and this is a great time to majorly support gap your opponent, who is like a Hall of Famer, quite frankly, on the other side of this. So nice stuff from Paris. I thought Ice was fine. He's just been fine throughout this year. It's kind of disappointing to see what Ice has become. He still is a very good team fighter, but his lack of laning ability is much more exposed now that this team doesn't have other forces that are dominating early on in the 1v1. Or they don't have a jungler that can just kind of scale the game out late anyways. Like losing LeBrav and losing Sheo, I think has done a lot to change the identity of how this team ends up playing, and I think that has hurt Ice overall, even if his mechanics are still fine. 113 still gets a lot more criticism than I think he deserves. I think he's actually been fine over the course of this split. Not great. Like, I'm not trying to sit here and, say that he's been phenomenal, but I don't think he's been a disaster for BDS, and Irrelevant has been kind of bad and continues to be irrelevant, quite frankly, on the top side. I'm really not sold on how he has played for BDS. He's genuinely just been one of the weaker top laners in the entire league, but Nuke has been so good, and Paris had a really nice series here that's enough to get BDS over the top, because Vitality is just going to beat themselves, and we've talked about that all year long up until this point when it comes to Vitality. They control every single game that they are going to play, because they are either going to be the best team on the Rift if Carzzy and Hylissang and Knock can really step up and dominate these games, or they're going to completely run it because Carzzy and Hylissang are so flippy, are so like feast or famine in terms of the way they play the game. Obviously, Hylissang is done of the series. I don't really have to go into that all that much. Anybody who watched these games would know that Hylissang was an absolute disaster, but again, I want to remind people, because you see it so often online, Hylissang is the reason this team has the number 5 seed. Like, I don't really think they win a ton of games in the regular season without Hylissang. I think they're an interesting team. I think players like Knock have been really interesting. GIANTX has been really interesting. Carzzy has played well, but I think Hylissang has been the primary creator for everything that Vitality has been doing so far in 2025, and just because he gives and takes, like, you just have to live with that. Like, you are here in the first place because of him. If he's the one who ends up underperforming and knocking you out, like, that's what you sign up for with Hylissang. But as much as I'd like to sit here and say, like, oh, Carzzy has solidified that stability that he was showing in the regular season, I should trust my own advice and say it doesn't matter how good Carzzy looks at any one point in time, any given moment in any given game, he can throw it all away, and he can just int it away. That's what he did with an ultimate in game number 3 on the Kai'Sa, where he just jumps onto the backline and instantly dies, and it's just an absolutely miserable thing for Vitality. It really takes them out of that game. GIANTX scoreline looks really good, and I do think he was useful, but we need to start having a conversation about Mel. This champion is not very good at the pro level, or at least it has not been successful. It has yet to win a game in any major region. We've talked about it a ton on this channel, especially when we went over the LCK playoffs in particular. It just doesn't look particularly effective. It's doing a lot of damage, and it's just not winning fights. Like, if it's going to be one of your primary or secondary carry options, I just think it's going to lack in that role in comparison to a lot of the other mid laners that are being played right now. The safety of that champion is very difficult to execute because you have one safety move, and, good teams are just going to bait that out early on in fights and then throw everything at the Mel to not really allow her to stack up her passive. It just isn't working at the pro level, even if I think GIANTX played really well in this series, specifically in that game 2 on the Ahri. Knock continues to be very impressive. He was the better top laner of these two in this series, which is great. Linsauce is fine. Like, I'm a lot lower on what he has been over the past year and a half than I think a lot of other people are. I loved him in the ERLs, but he has just not translated that to the LEC, at least in my opinion so far. But Vitality runs through this bot lane. If Hylissang's going to run it down, they're not going to win this series. It really is as simple as that. And unfortunately, like, that's the ceiling for Vitality. This team, to me, wasn't a team that expected to get top 5 or top 6 in split 1. I think, 7th or 8th is a totally fine finish for a team like Vitality, considering everything that happened in the offseason and just how unproven this team is, generally speaking. But this is an important win for BDS because their expectations were much higher than a team like Vitality's to be very good from day number 1. They've been a Worlds contender both of the last 2 years, and I think they really expected to be able to maintain that momentum going into 2025. It's not necessarily happened, but a win like this at least puts them in a position to, pull off one upset, and now all of a sudden you're in the top 4, and then the entire narrative kind of changes. But then moving on to our second of the lower bracket round 1 matchups, and this one was a lot easier to predict on paper for me, although there were some hiccups. It wasn't exactly the easiest in the world. It was the number 8 seeded Team Heretics taking on the number 6 seeded GIANTX, and GX is predictably going to be moving forward, moving on to round number 2. I think they ran into more trouble than maybe they were anticipating here in this series. I do not think Heretics was expected to put up much of a fight in this matchup. I have talked about it all year. I think I might be a little bit against popular opinion in this regard, but it feels a lot more like a bottom 3 than it does a bottom 2 in the LEC. As bad as SK and Rogue have been, I don't think Heretics is on the level of the other 3 teams that I would consider middle of the pack right now: GIANTX, BDS, and Vitality. Feels like they are like a clear-cut tier below that, just because I think their consistency has not necessarily been there. And you know what? Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the record was legit in the regular season, and maybe this kind of performance is something that is sustainable. But as per usual, they have good flashes, and they just can't find any sort of consistency in the end. For GIANTX, I mean, their game plan is as clear as it gets. It's play through bot lane. It's been that from day number 1. It is, week number 1, they go 3-0 because the bot lane absolutely decimates all of their matchups. And when they lose because their bot lane is not the better bot lane. It is very clear what GIANTX wants to be as a team right now, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. At least in this series, it does end up working out for them. Player of the series, because of that, is going to go to Noah in the bot lane. There are very few AD carries right now in the world that are receiving as many resources as Noah is. It's kind of crazy how much of his team's gold he actually ends up being in a lot of these games, and I get that that's a little bit of an inflated number, because when you look at the winning games here, he's playing Kai'Sa, he's playing Zeri. These are champions that you do want to get super fed, and like Jackie's is playing Talia, he's playing Orianna, he's playing these champions that are supposed to function really well, being a little bit lower resource, but GIANTX is the only team in the LEC that's drafting Zeri Yuumi right now, and shout out Zeri Yuumi. We saw it succeed in the LCK when Gen G ended up pulling it out in Game 5. And I'm gonna say a lot of the same things that I said in that video right now, which is that I think really the only reason we're not seeing this bot lane more in the current game is because people don't want to play Yuumi. Like, genuinely, I think that that's like the only real reason that this has not been more prevalent. I think this bot lane's very difficult to deal with, and they're basically inevitable. Noah obviously did a great job getting online and being relevant on the Zeri this game. This is a Zeri comp. If he's not strong, they're not winning this game. Although Lot was really good on the top side, which we will get into. But, if Jun's just gonna be your backpack, you have to step up as Zeri, and those extra stats, they really do matter, especially later on in these Fearless drafts when you're looking at things like Sivir on the other side of this matchup. Sivir's never going to be able to match the damage that Zeri is going to be able to output in the back half of this game, and it just became pretty unwinnable for Heretics, I think, especially once that Zeri started to get out of control. So credit to Noah, credit to Jun for being able to put his pride aside and say, screw it, I'm going to pick Yuumi in the bot lane. That's just kind of the direction I want to go in. I'm a fan of that, obviously, if only because I think teams are, going to be winning with it. I'm not a fan of it as a viewer because games are significantly more boring when Zeri Yuumi is good, but if teams want to win, then they should probably draft this because it is really good. Lot was also really solid on the top side. His Jace was really good. I think we've seen some pluses and minuses in terms of Jace so far in pro play. We've seen it work really well in very specific and certain situations, but for the most part, this champ has actually not been particularly successful in pro, and obviously the meme is that Western Jaces are just not nearly as good as Eastern Jaces, and that's kind of been the case. Kana has really been the only player who's had any success on Jace so far in the LEC. Lot ends up pulling it out here, and he plays great. Like, this is the advantage of Jace, is you can punish matchups like Sion incredibly heavily in this game number 3, which is really frustrating. We'll get to it for Heretics because Carlson played the best series he's ever played in the history of his life in this one, especially that game number 2 on the Camille. He was phenomenal in that game, and then they stick him on Sion duty just to get absolutely blasted by Jace in game number 3. Definitely kind of a feels bad moment, but Lot looked very good in that third game. Closer was good as a facilitator. I thought Jackie's was fine, but I don't think Jackie's has taken that next leap. I don't think he's taken that step that I think we were hoping he was going to take going into year number 2. He's just kind of been a good mid laner, which is a bit disappointing, but at the end of the day, this bot lane is the focal point. They are the main characters of GIANTX, and they got them across the finish line that they were supposed to get across. And then for Heretics on the other side, I think there are positive takeaways from this series. I think that there are things that you're going to look back on and say, like, this might have been the best that we looked all year long, or it's certainly up there with one of the more complete performances. You just don't have the firepower to actually be able to take down a team like GIANTX, who is more talented than you in most areas. Obviously, a lot of inexperience coming in here in terms of the macro decisions and just generally playing safe throughout a lot of these games. I think the big problem that Heretics individually ran into is just too many players getting caught out too regularly. Like, I understand that that just kind of comes with the territory of having so many young, inexperienced players on the roster, having Karlsson, Camelou, and Stend all be, like, true rookies, but this team really needs to clean up their mid and late games because they're just gifting gold over to GIANTX, and I think a lot of times a lot of these trades aren't necessarily in their favor. I've been very vocal across this entire year about how I think that, like, Karlsson has not been particularly good. He's maybe been the worst top laner so far in the LEC, about how Camelou, while he's had, like, moments of, you know, showing really good form and, you know, just bright spots in general, they've not been consistent at all, and when he loses incredibly hard. I think that wasn't as true in this series, which is a good sign. I think that's when you start to look at the positives. Karlsson was awesome, I would say, pretty much across all 3 games, specifically in that game 2 on the Camille. He played the best game he had ever played at any pro level, in my opinion. I think that this was genuinely a fantastic performance from him, and I wish they gave him something more aggressive to play off of in game number 3, but again, Scion Duty ended up calling, and he ended up not really being able to match that same kind of pressure that he put out in game 2. He was good on the Mbessa in game 1 as well. Karlsson was definitely the best player on the Rift for Heretics across this series, but when you look at Camelou in particular in the mid lane, he's kind of who I'm talking about, where you can see the moments, you can see what Heretics sees in Camelou in particular, because again, a lot of people were stunned by the promotion of Camelou essentially from tier 3 to tier 1, you know, skipping over the entirety of tier 2, and at times it's looked okay, right? There have been a couple of games where it's looked solid. He's lost a lot of games for this team this year, and he continues to just be a little bit too much of a wild card for this team to find any sort of consistency in the middle of the map. Even with Jackie's not necessarily pressuring as much as, you know, a lot of other mid laners have pressured him throughout this split. Sheo was fine. Flakked was doing his best. Couldn't really carry these games. He's way too important to be the lesser of 280 carries in any individual series if this team ever wants a chance of winning. And dud of the series for me is going to go to Stend in the support position. You just kind of have to learn from these experiences. I don't love Elise support. I really am just not in a position where I'm a fan of Elise support right now. I think the Lulu is a lot more kind of what I want to see from a team like Heretics right now, trying to enable a hyper carry in the back half of the game, but the problem was that GX just had a better hyper carry with a better setup on the other side, and that was kind of a negative. But Stend continues to be up and down, we'll just say. That's who Heretics is. This is not a team that I think is going to find a ton of consistent success over the course of this year. You can see the flashes, even in this series. Again, Karlsson looked really good. I think Camelou had some great moments. Flakked had moments where he looked really solid, but we have yet to see consistent success and consistent time periods where Heretics can put it all together regularly, like in back-to-back games or something like that. So kind of out on Heretics in terms of being a now contender, but I get what they're building towards. And then this is a nice win for GIANTX, but it does not get easier from here. You just beat the weakest team in the playoffs, quite frankly, and it actually took you quite a bit of effort to do so. Yes, your bot lane and your top side continue to look good, but the middle of the map has to start stepping up and has to start being what we expect from GIANTX, or they're not going to be as dominant as maybe they would hope to be going into the playoffs. But now that we've wrapped up the lower bracket round number 1 series, let's go ahead and jump into our lower bracket round number 2 series. These are going to be matchups between the teams that did win earlier on in the video, the lower bracket round number 1 teams, and then all the teams that lost in round 2 of the upper bracket. So those are going to be the teams that won in round 1 but couldn't win in round 2. You guys get how a tournament works. You get how a double elimination bracket ends up looking. The first one is definitely one of the more intriguing ones to talk about in terms of results. It was the number 1 seeded Fnatic taking on the number 7 seeded Team BDS. And Fnatic is going to walk out of this series with a win, and BDS will be eliminated from the playoffs here, but man, should it have not gone this way. It really genuinely should have been the other way around. Fnatic absolutely gets lucky to be able to walk out of this. Obviously, that game 3 throw from BDS is completely egregious. You can look at this from any angle that you want. Irrelevant was so far ahead on the top side. Nuke was in a really good position on the Syndra. It felt like you had your late game with the Jinx online and ready to go. This felt like a pretty unlosable game, quite frankly, for BDS, and yet somehow, some way, they end up throwing it away by team fighting incredibly poorly, by having no agency in the back half of the game and just not really doing anything, just gifting the win over to Fnatic. And it was kind of the same case in game number 1. Like, Fnatic walks out of game 1 pretty lucky that they ended up winning it as well. So you don't feel great about this series if you're Fnatic. You were already frustrated, I think, as a Fnatic fan by losing to G2, and, you know, you were this number 1 team and you were undefeated and you looked so good, and you come in and, you know, get kind of blasted by G2, kind of get proven like, you know, G2 wasn't necessarily trying. You're not the number 1 team in the LEC, and now you come down to the lower bracket and, like, squeak out a win against BDS. Like, I don't feel great about that. Player of the series is kind of up to you. 2, I'm going to give it to Upset. I get why people would want to give it to Oscarinin, but I just can't reasonably give it to Oscarinin. He was so relevant in the team fights in Game 3 that I can get behind that part, and even in Game number 1, like, he was really influential towards why they won that, but he is a reason why they had to come back in Game number 3, because Irrelevant was just way too strong on the Mbessa, way too far up, and yet, like, here we are, like, hoping and praying that Oscar can get back into it. Luckily, he can, because he's better than Irrelevant. That has been proven over the course of this split, but man, like, I don't think Oscar was particularly consistent, even though a lot of people, like, I've been praising him. I think he's had a fantastic split, but Upset to me was the one player you could look at throughout basically every moment and say, at the very least, it's not your fault. The Jhin was doing more than the Jinx in the back half of Game number 3. That alone, that enough is going to give me, you know, player of the series vibes. Like, that's Upset getting player of the series with that kind of performance. I'm a Jhin defender. You know, I've been pretty vocal about that on this channel over the past, like, 3 years or so. I think this is a good Jhin draft overall, and Upset's been so aggro, he's been so willing to try and trade, he's been so in your face with his playstyle that I think something like this is actually pretty scary going into the late game, and Upset kind of proved why he was really good in this series. I think Humanoid and Razork both had their moments, but honestly, both of them played worse than their counterparts on the other side. Specifically, Humanoid was worse than Nuke on the other side of this, even if Nuke completely trolled Game number 3 on the Syndra. Like, Humanoid just wasn't popping off. He's not really playing like a phenomenal, you know, carry player right now. Razork was unreal in the regular season and has been just a guy so far in the important playoff series that they've gone through. Like, there are real concerns, and Dud of the series is staying on the winning side. How can I not give it to someone from Fnatic? I'm giving it to Mickey X. Quite frankly, there's not really that big of a difference between how Mickey X played in this series and how Hylissang played against BDS in round number 1. Like, I get that Mickey has a better reputation. He's been, you know, better in a lot of people's eyes over the course of this split, but there really wasn't a lot of gameplay differences between those two series. Mickey getting caught out a ton, being in bad positions, being way too overeager, and kind of putting Fnatic in large holes early on in games that they have to dig themselves out of, except Fnatic was good enough to be able to dig themselves out of it. Upset is better than Carzzy, and that allowed them to be able to, you know, make these plays happen against BDS that Vitality weren't able to make, but Mickey was awful here. And again, I think you could reasonably give this to someone like Razork as well, because I don't think he played fantastic in this series. I'm just not sold at all by Fnatic in this series. I'm really, really concerned. That being said, they're going to go into that 4th place matchup favorites over basically anybody. I still think this is a team that absolutely can make finals, but so it's not a great look for them. Like, and BDS, it looks even worse for them, if we're being honest, on the other side of this, because how do you lose this series? How do you lose game number 3? How do you lose game number 1? This was a 3-0 in favor of BDS, and somehow, some way, they're eliminated from the playoffs because they just can't close games. It's super frustrating to watch, and I think you can point the finger in a lot of different directions. I think Irrelevant was just not good enough in this series. He had a ton of resources in game 3 and did absolutely nothing with them. Nuke's build in game 3 is obviously receiving a lot of attention, but his gameplay was just as bad, in my opinion, on the Syndra. It felt like he misplayed in a couple of very crucial fights. His positioning was really awful. I don't think Paris was really, like, affecting the game as much as he could. 113 was fine. I don't think he was the problem, and Ice certainly wasn't the problem. He should have been able to carry this game, but he had no facilitators on his team to allow the Jinx to take over any of these fights. You're basically in a dream scenario if you're Ice, and the rest of the team completely throws it away. You just have to be frustrated. The fact that you had so many consistent leads that it felt like this team was finally going to live up to its preseason potential and pull off this gigantic upset against Fnatic, sending them out in 5th place in the winter split after they were the number 1 seed going into the playoffs, and yet you just couldn't capitalize. You got to feel frustrated by this, and obviously you got to figure it out and turn it around, but I guess if there are positive takeaways, you basically 3-0'd Fnatic if you were able to close out any of these games. That proves that this team can be a top 2 or top 3 team in the LEC if everything were to click, but there are just a lot of things that this team has to figure out and fix, because this was just not good enough as a result with everything that happened at the beginning. But Fnatic's thinking it's lucky stars. They're moving on to that best of 5 stage. They're going to get to play at least one best of 5. Obviously, they're going to be going into that not really with a ton of momentum. This series should have been a loss. They kind of got destroyed by G2. Like, this is the low point of the winter split so far for Fnatic, but what I've learned is that the only times Fnatic really underperforms are when people actually start hyping them up. Now that people are low on them, perhaps they go into that series and just end up dominating. They get to finals and they get 0-3'd by G2 either way. It'd be funny, you know, the narrative-wise, but there are definitely a lot of concerning traits with Fnatic coming out of the last 2 series that I think I need to see some reversals on before I'm just all in on them being a title contender again. Then moving on now to our second of these round number 2 lower bracket series, our final best of 3 of the playoffs. Thank God they're almost over, and it's the biggest blowout of the video so far. It's Movistar KOI, the number 4 seed, taking on the number 6 seeded GIANTX, and KOI absolutely obliterated them. This was not a close series. This was not even really all that back and forth. You can look at a couple of things in particular that just blow this entire series wide open and make it very difficult for GIANTX to play, but at the end of the day, if the bot lane can't take over and carry games, if the top side is just going to get outplayed, and the middle of the map in particular is just going to get outplayed in the way that they did in this series, it's going to be pretty unwinnable for GIANTX, and that's kind of the situation that they ended up falling into here. Let's go ahead and talk about it. I might not spend as much time on this series as I have the other 3 so far, because again, there's just not as much to analyze because KOI obliterated them. This was kind of a blowout, but player of the series is very obviously going to go to Elyoya in the jungle. We've been really waiting for a performance like this. I've been very impressed by Mirwin, Supa, and Alvaro so far to start 2025. I was a big Mirwin hater in 2024, and we'll talk about him a bit more as we move forward because the Vex is clearly stealing a lot of attention in terms of the news cycle in the top lane there as an answer to Mbessa, but Supa and Alvaro have been phenomenal to start this year. Mirwin's been very good. It's been the middle of the map that's been a bit more hit or miss, we'll just say, for KOI, and honestly, it's jungle mid that's keeping them out of the top 3 conversations in my mind, or at least that's what it was going into this week, where it felt like Fnatic, Corp, and G2 just had much more well-rounded rosters. They didn't have a weakness like KOI had in the middle of the map, where it felt like they were just so flippy and inconsistent. Not that Elyoya and Jojopyun are bad players. They're certainly not bad players. We've seen both of them completely pop off. Elyoya was the number 1 jungler in Europe for years, for a long time, at least on this channel. I considered him the number 1 jungler for a long time. I expected Jojo to come in and be a top 2 mid laner from day number 1, and while they have shown flashes of being that, there's just not really been a lot of consistency when it comes to that part of the game. When they lose against top teams, it's often through the middle of the map, and so to see Elyoya pop off in this kind of way against GIANTX was super important for me, and I think very important for KOI to be able to understand that if these two play well, they're probably going to win a lot of games. They're probably going to be able to compete to be a top 2 team in the LEC. Elyoya was a monster specifically on the Nidalee in game number 2. I didn't really have to think about player of the series. This one was super obvious. He was that much better than not only closer, but basically everybody on the side of GIANTX just completely ran that early game in game 2. And then obviously Mirwin is the other player you kind of have to talk about on the top side here. The Vex into Mbessa, into game number 1. You know, Gyotto famously saying, we didn't exactly prep for this. You know, we didn't see this one coming when Mirwin had been spamming it in solo queue for weeks. Obviously, that's a bit of a funny comment. I think that there's probably more to it than that. I don't think it's quite as simple as we didn't prep for Vex. It was probably just we didn't expect Vex to come out in game number 1. Like, we just weren't anticipating that they were going to play it in this situation. And you know what? Whatever. Like, if that's the reality of it, then it is what it is. But this Vex absolutely did a ton of work, and the Poppy was also very relevant in game 2. I think Mirwin has genuinely taken a very big leap from last year to this year. I think he's been so much better in 2025 than he was in 2024, and I'm hoping he's going to be able to stay that level of consistent. His Mbessa and Cassante in particular have been way better, and so when he does pull out things like Vex top, it's even more of a shakeup, because last year he wasn't very good at the meta top laners. I think he's gotten a ton better at the meta top laners, which makes these off-meta picks even more dangerous. Supa and Alvaro continued to be very good. Like, Noah and Jun are the heart and soul and the core of GIANTX, and Supa and Alvaro were better on the other side, which is a problem for GX, and Jojopyun was definitely better than Jackie's. But really, at the end of the day, Elyoya completely ran game number 2. GX had no answer to game number 1. This was a pretty easy win for KOI that they didn't really have to work all that hard to get, and for GIANTX, that's definitely a disappointing end. I think 5th place is fine as a result. I think that that's totally within the realm of anticipation for GIANTX. I don't think they're going to be super frustrated that they couldn't break into the top 4, because it does feel like the top 4 are just better than everybody else in the LEC right now. It does feel like a 4-horse race to be relevant in terms of the finals, but GIANTX being the best of the rest, or at least in terms of record being the best of the rest, I think is relatively reasonable. I just think the way you went out is obviously frustrating. Basically, everybody just getting outplayed. Noah and Jun being the strength of your team and not really having any ability to take over these games. Both of them played well. I think that they were definitely the 2 best players on GIANTX across these 2 games, but it just didn't matter. Like, Supa and Alvaro were better, and KOI had so many advantages elsewhere on the map. Jackie's is going to get dud of the game, or dud of the series, I should say, for me. I think Jackie's has definitely been exposed a bit more in winter so far this year. This reminds me a lot more of spring split Jackie's from last year. I talked about this a lot last year on the channel when I did not give Jackie's my Rookie of the Year. I think people were so enamored by the summer split that they just forgot that he wasn't particularly good before that, or he wasn't consistent. He showed flashes in winter that made me very intrigued, and then he was one of the worst players in the entire league in spring, and then he was awesome in summer, and that trajectory obviously felt very good, but we're seeing some of the negatives that come with Jackie's just naturally. He's really not been that great of a mid laner so far in 2025. Hopefully he can turn that around. Lot got mega outplayed, got mega outdrafted in game number 1. Again, if they didn't prep against Vex into Ambessa, that is a bit of a problem. Closer got completely outjungled, specifically in that game 2 on the Xin Zhao. I really don't like Xin Zhao in this matchup against Nidalee, especially when Elyoya is just going to be the better jungler. Closer, I think, has some hits or misses. He's like the definition of a league average jungler, in my opinion, but GIANTX just kind of living up to what the expectations were. This is like a middle of the pack team, 5th, 6th, like that's the kind of result that you would expect from a team like GX, and I think even if this series is frustrating, I think being able to show that they are better than a lot of the bad teams and, worse than a lot of the good teams, that's kind of what we anticipated from this roster. And then for KOI on the other side, hopefully this is the start of them getting their shit together and just being able to actually be consistent for a longer period of time. Fnatic is a very beatable team right now in the LEC, and honestly, if Elyoya and JoJo show up for that series, who's to say that they're not just better than Fnatic in a best of 5, especially with where Fnatic is at right now? There is a real shot that KOI is starting to find its groove. We've seen this team, go on major runs in the winter last year, and so, nothing is impossible, and I'm excited to see if they can carry that form over. But that's going to bring us to our final series of the video, and it is the big one. It's Winners Finals, our first best of 5 here in the LEC. I would have loved to cover this game by game in its own separate video. We just didn't really have the time with the way everything was set up in the LEC. It felt like it made more sense to cover it in this video, and so the schedule is just going to kind of be a little bit jam-packed with all of the other regions that we have. I apologize if you were looking forward to me covering this game by game, but I promise I'll go very in-depth on this one to make up for it. It's a matchup between the number 3 seeded G2 Esports and the number 2 seeded Corp, and G2 is going to come out on top. They are going to pick up the win 3-1, so definitely not like the most dominant series. Corp is still able to pick up a game 2 win where they did look very good, but outside of that, this was all G2. I mean, games 1, 3, and 4 were not close. Hell, game 2 wasn't close. This was back-to-back-to-back-to-back blowouts in favor of whoever ended up winning this, and so not exactly the most entertaining series in the entire universe, but we definitely got a clearer picture, I think, for the top of the standings with this series. Obviously, with this victory, G2 is going to qualify for grand finals as the number 3 seed. It feels like this team just figures it out every single year. Once they get into the playoffs, more likely they're just not trying as hard in the regular season. They get to these important best of 5s, later on, best of 3s in the playoffs, and that's when they actually start playing a lot of the things that they are really good at. They allow their players to really start taking over because some of the notable increases in just production from a lot of these players is something that we're definitely going to talk about. But for Corp, I think some of their flaws also kind of got exposed here. I think that this is still a team that you have to watch out for, and very well could be a team that gets a rematch with G2 in the finals if things continue to go the way that they have recently, but this is not a perfect team. They definitely have their own individual flaws that we'll talk about a bit here. Player of the series, to me, pretty obviously kind of has to go to Broken Blade on the top side, and boy, am I excited and happy to say that because I've kind of been a little bit of a Broken Blade hater over the course of this split. It's funny because my Broken Blade history on this channel is very, it's both ends of the spectrum. We'll just say that. On TSM and when he first got to Schalke, I was so anti-Broken Blade. I was like, this guy needs every resource in the world. He can't play weak side. He's kind of a resource hog, and he's a player that is actively hurting your team if you're giving him a lot of resources, because it means you can't go anywhere else because he can't play without resources even a little bit. He comes to G2, figures it all out, becomes one of my favorite top laners, is somebody that I think is very versatile, can play almost any style, is very good at tanks now, very good at playing weak side, can still play strong side at a really high level, is just an elite player, and now he comes back out in the start of 2025, and he's just kind of been there. Like, there have been top laners that have been more impressive than him. Players like Kana and Oscarinen, I think, have just been better than Broken Blade so far in 2025, but leave it to Broken Blade to step up when it matters the most in a series like this. Yeah, that was a Cho'Gath game in game number 4. We'll say it. Like, obviously you can see it, but boy howdy, like Cho'Gath Anivia in game number 4, didn't know I needed that from G2, but it turns out that is basically unbeatable for any team in the world because this felt like an absolute decimation. Now, a lot of that is an answer to the first pick Draven on the other side of this, which I think is just a complete question mark from Corp. I do not understand that pick at all, but give a lot of credit where credit is due. Broken Blade was genuinely unstoppable on Cho'Gath. Not only was he doing a billion damage per fight because he has, you know, a 2000 true damage execute on his ultimate, but he is a mega tank. He's got a ton of CC. His silence is a really big problem for a lot of this team if he can land it on Seraphine or Ryze or someone like that. Even Viego to stop the resets, it can become a bit of a problem, and obviously he doesn't die, and that's a big part of this. Like, Broken Blade was just a nuisance in the back half of this, and he was good throughout the rest of the series too. The Renekton and the Poppy games were both very solid from him. Kana has been the best top laner in the LEC, and so to see Broken Blade come out and just kind of be better than him here in this series is definitely a reassertion that he is still the top laner to beat in Europe. I really want to give a big shout out to Caps as well. Obviously, I know I do this every single series, but really like the way he drafts, man. Like Talia, Yone, even the Aurora, obviously the Anivia in game number 4 that K-Corp had absolutely no answer to. It's all like great stuff. Vladi was pretty good on the other side of this matchup. I think he was the best player for K-Corp this series, but Caps was better than him, and I think that was kind of asserted by that game 4 gameplay on Anivia. He was very good at the beginning of this series as well, though, just very willing to move around the map and skirmish a lot. He understands what it takes to be good on this map and in this meta, and I think he executes that well. Hansama and Labrov were very good here. I think Labrov is starting to really click with the rest of this team. He was really punishing Kaliste by the end of this series, and I think even more impressively is just the development of Skewmond. Obviously, this was a very hyped matchup for a couple of reasons, because it's Yike playing against G2 and playing against his replacement. And I don't think Yike played very well in this series. We'll get to that when we get to K-Corp, but Skewmond did so many good things in this series. I think he's gotten better series over series. I was very critical of his regular season. I think people were mega overrating what he was domestically, like in the best of ones. Like in the regular season, I just don't think he was particularly good. He had gold leads, and he just had no idea what to do with them in the mid and late game, and I think he was making a lot of mistakes that led to some of the more noticeable, like, you know, the miss smites are obviously there, but he was making bigger mistakes than that throughout the regular season. If you look at the numbers, I'm not sure that plays into the numbers, but it definitely showed up on tape, and I think he has gotten better in the playoffs. I think, again, this team is just generally playing around a lot of their pieces better. Labrov feels better incorporated. Skewmond feels better incorporated. I think generally Caps and Broken Blade are finally back to where they're supposed to be, and Hansama is just Hansama. This is how he's always played in the playoffs domestically. I talked about it last week, so nice win for G2. Not a particularly surprising one, but basically everything you could have wanted to see out of G2 to like reassure you that they were going to be the best team in the LEC, they kind of showed you in this series. And then for K-Corp on the other side, I do think this team is really good. I think that they're probably still the second best team in the LEC. G2 is just kind of on a different level right now, and I think some of the young players definitely kind of got that exposed. The bot lane probably had their worst series all year long. Kaliste is going to get my dud of the series here in the bot lane. I just don't really know how I can give it to anybody else. Obviously the Yasuo in game 3, but the Draven in game 4, like the first pick Draven just getting absolutely destroyed by this Anivia wall and like not really having ways to be able to escape a lot of the damage coming out here from G2. It was just so easily punished, and you know, that's kind of Kaliste's fault. I get he wants to trust himself and he wants to play something aggro that can carry the game, but it ended up really backfiring, and I just don't think he was good enough here today. Targamas was another player that I just don't think had like a fantastic series or anything like that. He definitely showed a lot more of what he showed the past couple of years, even if he wasn't nearly as detrimental as he usually is. Yike got mega out-jungled this series. That was a pretty major problem for K-Corp in this one. Yike has been one of the best players in the LEC so far in 2025. He needed to show up and be the better jungler in this series if K-Corp wanted a real chance of being able to win. It didn't happen. Kana wasn't nearly as good as Broken Blade. Vladi was okay, but still didn't really get to do all that much on a lot of these mages. We talk about it all the time. Vladi has probably the lowest highs of anybody on this team. Not to be disrespectful to Vladi, he has the highest floor by far. His bad games are the best of anybody on this team, but I think he sometimes can fade into the background a bit, if only because his best games aren't nearly as flashy as like Kana or Yike or Kaliste, and you know, I think sometimes that makes people forget about him. He's still a really good player, and I thought he was good in this series, but again, just not enough to be able to carry this team across the finish line. They need more than just Vladi in the mid lane in order to win a series against G2, and that just ended up being the case. What it feels like is that K-Corp is a very good team with a lot of really good things going for them, and G2 is just kind of out of everybody's league again, because that's just what's happened in Europe every single year. I'm not shocked by this outcome. I'm not shocked that they were blowouts. The only thing I'm surprised by is that G2 wasn't doing this sooner. We all knew that G2 was eventually going to get online, whether that was this split or later on in the year. I think the only frustrating part for K-Corp is just how soon it happened. They go down to the semifinals now, though, and they will be playing the winner of KOI versus Fnatic. They can win that series. They can beat both Fnatic and KOI. I feel very confident in saying that. I definitely think they can beat KOI because they already have. I'm pretty sure they can beat Fnatic as well, but you know, they're going to have to be able to pick that up because G2 is waiting for them in the finals. finals. This team is just unbelievable. Like, they just figure it out every single year. It's actually ridiculous, the pacing and the general trend that G2 is always on. They always seem to get better when it matters the most domestically and just completely outclass everybody in these best of threes and best of fives. I think a lot of that has to do with their veteran experience in these series. Players like Broken Blade and Caps and Hansama have played so many best of fives over the course of their career that I think they're just a little bit better prepared, we'll just say, for a series like this. But at the end of the day, there is some G2 magic in the air. They find these really funky drafts like they did in game number 4, and they're able to come out on top. You just have to give this org a lot of credit. Say what you will about whether it's fun or entertaining that the same team keeps winning, but they have asserted over and over again that they are the kings of Europe. All right, but that is going to do it for my LEC Round 2 and Round 3, and I guess kind of Round 4 overview and analysis of the Winter Split Playoffs. We only have 4 teams remaining in the bracket. We know that G2 is guaranteed to be in Grand Finals. We know that K-Corp is guaranteed to be 1 series away, to be in lower finals, the semifinals to qualify for that. Movistar KOI and Fnatic will obviously face off to see who ends up facing K-Corp, to see who ends up facing G2, but let's go ahead and go over my predictions really quick. Who do I think is going to be moving on? Well, between KOI and Fnatic, I think this one is a little bit difficult to predict because, again, KOI looked so much better in round 2 than Fnatic did. I think that there were so many things to take away from the KOI victory that gave me hope and encouragement, but at the same time, Fnatic has looked so much better over the course of this year that I have a hard time betting against them. Right now, I still favor Fnatic in this series, even if they have not necessarily looked like the team that they're supposed to be. Right now, I still think that they're going to be able to figure it out, get over the hump, and get to where they need to be. I expect Fnatic to be able to pick up this series, mostly through the middle of the map. I think Razork versus Elyoya will definitely determine how this series ends up going. But as for whether or not I think either can beat K-Corp, I think both could beat K-Corp. I absolutely do believe that the winner of KOI and Fnatic has a pretty big advantage going into the semifinals, having the confidence of being able to beat one of those other teams. If it's KOI, I think it's less confidence just because they've already lost to K-Corp in the playoffs, but I think Fnatic really does believe that they are just better than K-Corp, and I think there's a lot of reason to believe that that could be the case. Right now, I'm kind of leaning in favor of K-Corp picking up that victory and, going back to the finals, but I think K-Corp versus Fnatic is more interesting for me. I think if I had to rank the 3 teams that are left that aren't in the finals yet, that aren't G2, I would rank probably K-Corp barely at 1, Fnatic at 2, and then KOI at 3 in terms of my personal projections right now. Let me know if you agree or disagree with that down in the comments. Do you think that Fnatic should be the favorite to make it to the finals? Do you think that KOI is, going to be able to carry over their hot form and that the middle of the map is going to shore itself up in these big games? Let me know what you think down in the comments section below. I'm always curious to hear your thoughts and opinions, but that's gonna do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We're gonna be covering the rest of this LEC playoff tournament, of course, all the way through finals. The other playoffs have also been covered on this channel. LTA and LCK are done. The LPL is getting very close to its finals. We just covered the, I guess, round 3 and round 4 matchups, winners finals for the LPL yesterday. You can check those videos out on the channel, and we'll be covering LPL finals on this channel very shortly as well. I'm very excited for it. I hope you guys are as well. If you are, hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all